So last time we went through Malachim Aleph chapter 6, and we brought up some issues there, some specific issues that we were interested in regarding the placement of the Kruvim in the Beit HaMikdash, among things, and certain aspects of the dimensions of Bayit Rishon, and I wanted to show you. What did I want to show you? Before we start looking at the Gemara, we'll have to come back to these psukim. So I don't know if anybody looked at the pages I sent, and but it's okay if you didn't. I just thought it would be nice if you had some advance warning of what we're going to do. And you see now my download speed must be very bad because this is taking a long time to come up. Goodness. Okay, so I have it here. We'll do it instead of online. I'll do it off of Bar Ilan. So look, okay. I'm going to start from here. So we saw in the Sefer Melachim, we saw various aspects of the way the Beit HaMikdash was built. We raised several questions, and I just wanted to add a couple more psukim into the mix. There are parallels between the passages that we saw in Sefer Melachim to passages that are in Divrei Hayamim. So let's look a little bit at this is Divrei Hayamim Bet, Perek Gimel, and this is parallel to things that we saw in Melachim Aleph Perek Vav, and there's also some psukim in Perek Chet that we'll have to come back to. But let's just take a look. Vayachel Shlomo livnot et Beit Hashem b'Yerushalayim b'Har Moriah, asher nira leDavid avihu, asher achin b'Imam David b'Gar Arnon haYebusi. Okay, so Shlomo begins to build the Beit HaMikdash. Vayachel livnot b'chodesh hasheni b'sheni b'shnat arba lemalchuto. That's when he begins. Ha'ulam asher, I'm sorry, I skipped. Ve'ele husad shlomo livnot et Beit Elok. Ha'orech amot b'midah harishona amot shishim v'rochav amot esrim. So it gives the same, it starts off with the same basic dimensions for the Beit HaMikdash proper. It's 60 amot long and it's 20 amot wide. So the ulam is on the front of the width, of the length of the house. It's 20 amot wide. And it's 120 high. The big house was covered with eitz broshim and with cedar wood or some kind of wood like that, and it was covered with good gold, and on it were date palms and chains, right? So some kind of pattern was put onto the walls. The house was covered also with precious stones for its glory, Vahazahav Zahav Parvayim, and the gold was Parvayim gold, which is apparently a particular kind of gold or came from a particular place. Everything was covered with gold. And kruvim were engraved onto the walls. So exactly how the layout of the walls was, like what exactly like and how the kruvim fit into the patterns, we'll leave that to our imaginations for the moment. So the Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim, its length was on the face of the width of the house, Amot Esrim, V'rachbo Amot Esrim. It was 20 by 20. Zahav Tov, V'chikarim Sheshmiot. It was 600 kikarim, loaves or talents of gold. Mishkal, Mismerot, Mishkalim, etc. We can skip that. This is something I want to point out. It's interesting. So here it talks about the kruvim. So now, remember, what we learned is that the kruvim in the Beit HaMikdash Shlomo were significantly different than the kruvim as are described in Sefer Shemot, right? Because in Sefer Shemot, the kruvim are described as being of beaten gold coming out of the kaporet, right? So apparently it was like one piece of gold that covered the kaporet, which is the board that's on top of the aron, right? So the aron is the aron per se is an open box. It's open on the top. It's covered by a kaporet, and then coming out of the kaporet were two kruvim facing one another. But in Bayit Shel Shlomo, there was an aron, and then next to it were these two huge kruvim. And what we saw, and we're going to talk about this again, is they had this wingspan. Each of them had a wingspan of 10 amot. So, bearing in mind that the width of the width and the width and the length of the Kodesh HaKodeshim was a square. It was 20 by 20. So, the simple way that we understood the psukim in back in Malachim, which is going to be to how we see it here, was that there were two kruvim that stood with their wings 10 amot high, and each of them had a wing that the let's say the one on one side touched the wall with its wing here, and the one on the other side touched the other wall with its wing here, and then their two wings would have been touching, presumably, right? Because it's 10 plus 10. Now, all of that assumes that we had two kruvim that are standing one next to the other in the same line, right? We're trying to keep, and it doesn't say otherwise, but this is also like a default place that I think our minds would go, that things would be set up in this kind of orderly fashion. So this is the way it's described here in, this is the way it's described here in Divrei Hayamim, Vayas bebet kodesh HaKodeshim kruvim. So he made two kruvim, ma'asei tzadwim, vayitzapu otam zahav. So now, this is just a little bit of an aside, and of course in modern Hebrew we know this word tzatzua is toy, and but here that's not what it means. And I don't have a Ben Yehuda dictionary to find out exactly how, and I'm guessing that it was he who established that tzatzua means toy. Tzatzuim here, all the Mephor say that it's like the word tzetzaim with aleph, and Tzetzaim would be offspring, meaning Maset Tzatzuim, that they were made to look like boys, children, which we know from other places. Maset Tzatzuim, and he brings. He says, "Dugmato." We see in Pasuk in Yeshayahu, "Hatzatzaim v'atzviot." The Targumo, it's translated as uvnaya, uvnaya tabnit, uvnaya, like boys, tabnit yiladim, like in the form of children. Yiladim v'yiladot. In other words, children, whether boys or girls. Yes.
Tzatzua is with Ayin, Tzetz with Aleph. Who is this? Rashi was an Ashkenazi. He didn't know the difference between Aleph and Ayin, so he could obviously got it wrong.
No. You're first of all, there are other. First of all, Rashi was an Ashkenazi. I'm not sure that Rashi didn't differentiate between Aleph and Ayin. That might, no, I don't. In other words, honestly, I don't know, because in halacha, which Rashi knew very well, there is a distinction between aleph and ayin in halacha, right? So in other words, when you speak, when you lein or when you read Shema, you're supposed to say Shema. It's supposed to be a guttural. It's a deep guttural. Aleph is a light guttural, but ayin is a deep guttural. Besides which, Rashi's basing his Perush on the Targum. The Targum translates it, B'naya, children. That's the Targum. And it's also not just Rashi, it's also the Radak, who was Italian. Basically, all of the Meforshim understood it to be this way. This is not, it's not for us to project our concepts of the way Ashkenazim pronounce or don't pronounce letters. That's not what's going on here. I'll tell you, the philological problem is this word appears nowhere else in Tanakh, and so one of the ways that it will be understood is, Meforshim will always look to the Targum, particularly the Targum Yonatan and the Targum Unklis. Now, the Targum on Divrei Hayamim, which would be the Targum of Ktuvim, I don't know that anybody knows who wrote that, but Unklis and Yonatan ben Uziel, who were both Tanaim or student, Unklis was a student of Tanaim, and Yonatan ben Uziel was a Tana in his own right, and they're seen as reliable translations, even though Rashi, the Radak, Rishonim don't always agree with them, but in general, they will look to them as a basis for translation. But we have other examples in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, where ayin and aleph are mitchalef. This isn't the only place. But as I'm speaking, and I should have written them down. There are other ones that we know, and I can't bring any to mind right now. But there are other places where ayin and aleph exchange. Again, because they are both gutturals. It's just that in other words, we hardly say it. We don't gutturalize the aleph at all. Like, we consider it to be a silent letter. It's not truly silent. It's not truly a silent letter. It's a light guttural. Anyway, I just thought I would point that out because it's an interesting tidbit. It's not a mistake. And the idea that Satsuim means a toy, I assume it comes from this idea, right? But that's clearly not what it's talking about in the pasuk. It's not saying that both of them were made like Maset Satsuim, that they were made as toys. That's not what it's talking about. It means, and we know from elsewhere, that the Kruvim looked like children. I think it's the Targum Unklis that translates Kruv as Kraviyah, Ravya in Aramaic means a child or a young person, and that's how he understood Kruv. In any event, this is a little bit on the side, although it's somewhat relevant just from this point of view. Later on, I don't think we're going to get there tonight in the Sugya and the Gemara. It is going to, one of the issues that's going to come up is where the Kruvim were facing, which direction were they facing. When we learn about the Kruvim in the Chumash, so they're built in such a way that they're facing one another. Now, as we'll see, it would seem by default that they're both going to be facing not each other, but they'll be facing, looking eastward toward the Heichal. So let's go on. Here it describes it as follows. The wings of the Kruvim, their length was 20 amot. And then it breaks it down. Kanaf echad va'amot chamesh. One wing was 5 amot. Magat lekir habayit, touching the wall of the house. V'hakanafa acheret amot chamesh. The other wing was 5 amot. Magia lichnaf hakruv ha'acher. It got up to or touched the wing of the other kruv. Uchnaf hakruv ha'echad amot chamesh magia lekir habayit. V'hakanaf ha'acheret amot chamesh dveka l'chnaf hakruv ha'acher. Okay, so the other one is described in the same way. It had a wing that was 5 amot that touched the wall of the house, that got up to the wall of the house, and the other wing that was 5 amot was stuck to the wing of the other kruv. So the wings of these kruvim were spread out 20 amot. V'hem omdim al ragleihem ufneihem labayit. They stood on their legs, and their faces were toward the bayit, were toward the house, presumably toward the heichal. This is what it would seem to me. So I wanted to point that out. And just to go back for a moment, this is back in Melachim. Let's look at these psukim here again. Vayas bedvir shnei kruvim atzei shamen eser amot komato. So he made in the dvir 2 kruvim of oil wood. We discussed that last time. Eser amot komato. Its height, in other words, the height of each kruv was 10 amot. V'chamesh amot kanaf hakruv ha'achat. V'chamesh amot kanaf hakruv ha'shenit. Eser amot miktzot kanafav yad ktzot kanafav. So let's read this pasuk carefully, and we'll see this. The Rashbam makes sure that we read it like this. It's the wing of the one kruv was 5 amot, and 5 amot was the wing of the kruv of you should read it, the second wing of the kruv, not the second kruv. Shenit goes back to knaf. It's the second knaf. And that's proven out by the next pasuk, as we'll see. So each of its knafayim were 5 amot, and the wingspan was 10 amot from the tip of the wings until the tip of the wings. The Eser ba'amah hakruv hasheni. So this is where it talks about the second kruv. In pasuk kafdal, it's talking about the 2 wings of the first kruv. And now in pasuk kafei, the Eser ba'amah hakruv hasheni. The second kruv it was also with 10 amot. Midah achat v'ketev echad l'shnei hakruvim. It was one measure and one shape for both of the kruvim. And here it says again, kumata kruva echad eser ba'ama v'chein hakruva sheni. Both of them were 10 amotai. Vayitenet hakruvim betoch habayit hapnimi. They were put inside the inner house, in other words, in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Vayifresu et kanfei hakruvim v'tigaf kaf ha'echad bakir uchnaf hakruv hasheni nogat bakir hasheni. So one of them, its wing touched the wall, and the wing of the second one touched the second wall, the other wall. V'chanfeihem el toch habayit, and I'll add in the word other, their other wings were toward the middle of the house. No goat kanaf el kanaf. The wings, right? The wings touched one another. Okay. So with that bit of a reminder and a little bit of extra, let's look at the Gemara in Baba Batra. So I will also say all of this, in a sense, it's not precisely the topic that I told you that I want to concentrate on, which is I started off this series of shiurim saying that I want to understand when the Kohen Gadol went into the Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim to do the Ketoret and to sprinkle the blood. Where exactly was the Ketoret placed? Where exactly did he stand? And how exactly did he throw the blood? The reason I'm going through all of these things, partly because it's interesting, but partly I believe in order to understand the reality of what where exactly the Kohen Gadol went, we're taking into account now, what we're doing is we're going to look at different possible realities, in the sense that there was the Mishkan, and then Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. Each of them had a different reality, because so now we know in Bayit Rishon, in the Mishkan, first of all, the Kodesh HaKodeshim was half the size; it was 10 by 10, and the Aron and the Kruvim were all essentially one piece. Here we have the Aron. Presumably, the Aron is going to be the same size, but now we also have these huge Kruvim that are standing there. And then, by very stark contrast, in Bayit Sheni, we don't have any of that. We just have an empty room. So, I'm trying to piece all this together in my own head. So I'm taking you along for the ride. Here, this is the Gemara that I sent you in Baba Batra. Now, I don't know if anybody looked at it, and we're not going to go through the whole sugya up until the third page. Like I told you, I do want to tell you a little bit about the context of the Gemara that we're going to do, and we're going to do that, but just by examining quickly the Mishnah that it's attached to. So the Mishnah here says, "Hamocher makom lechaveiro." So if you've ever learned Baba Batra deals with a lot of practical issues having to do with property, sales of property, and obligations that one might have. And here in this particular Mishnah, it's talking about there's certain standards. There's like tekken for different size houses or buildings, housings, depending on what the purpose is, meaning, as we'll describe, hamocher makom lechaveiro, v'chein hamekabel makom mechaveiro, la'asot lo beit chatnut libno, beit almanut levito, boneh arba amot al shesh divrei Rabbi Akiva. So if somebody sells a piece of property to his friend, or somebody has received a place from his friend, in either case, in order to make what was called a beit chatnu livno, a groom's house for his son. In other words, when his son's getting married, he's going to build him a house, beit almanut levito, or a widow's house for his daughter, meaning if his daughter was married, presumably the house she moved into is going to be the beit chatnut, right? She's going to move into the house with her groom. But if her groom / her husband dies, so she'll come back to live with her father. So he'll build her a beit almanut. He'll build her a place for a widow to live. Boneh arba amot al shesh. So when you build that house, it has to be at least 4 amot by 6 amot. In other words, unless otherwise specified, this was a standard. It's a standard size. Less than that would not be acceptable. So if you say, like if Reuven says to Shimon, I want to buy from you a place to build a Beit Chatnut, so then he pays money and whatever, it's going to be understood that that space is going to be big enough to build a house that's 4 by 6. That's what's going on here in Mishnah, basically. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael Omer Refet Bakar Hizu. This is like, that's the size of a stall for an ox. Harotzeh lasot refet bakar boneh daled al shesh. Somebody who wants to make a refet bakar, he builds that 4 by 6. Then, but bait katan, if you're building a small house, it's shesh al shmone, it's 6 by 8. Gadol, if you're building a big house, it's shmona al eser, it's 8 by 10. A traklin, which is like a palace, right? Like a larger area, it's going to be 10 by 10. Romo kechatzi arko ukechatzi rachbo. The height of these buildings is going to be the sum of half of its length to half of its width. So, Raya Davar, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer kebinyan ha'echal. A proof for this, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, it's like the building of the Heichal. This is going to be our connecting point. So, this Mishnah actually is somewhat difficult to read. I read it in a particular way to make it flow, but there are a lot of unclear reference within the Mishnah. And I'm going to leave them because it's not vital for our purpose. What's important for us is this last bit, where it says, okay, traklin is 10 by 10, and its height is its length and half of its width. So let's just look here in the Rashbam. So you might know that Rashi did not finish all of his perush on the Talmud, and there were certain particular that his grandson, the Rashbam, essentially did for him after Rashi passed away. The Rashbam was the oldest of Rashi's grandsons. So the perush where you normally see Rashi in most other Masechtot, you'll see the Rashbam. And we'll see because we're going to do a lot of the Rashbam in doing this sugya. The Rashbam's style was not like his grandmother's in the sense that Rashi, as we know, tends to be very short and to the point, ever possible. And the Rashbam, sometimes he is, and sometimes goes on quite at length. Because I don't want to say because, but remember the Rashbam in his generation, this was the first generation of the Baalei Tosfot. and they had a different style. It was not as succinct as Rashi. That's just by the way, but nonetheless, the Rashbam is a very he is, in my humble opinion, a very clear mefaresh, but he just doesn't have quite the skill, maybe, I don't know how to put it, the literary style of Rashi. Okay, anyway, so a train is 10 by 10. So traklin, Rashbam says, is l'moshav sarim asui, below the tashmish. This is a place, a traklin in this sense is a place for for princes or ministers, for the elite to sit. And it's not where even necessarily where they lived. It was just a place for them to hang out. Below the tashmish, it wasn't for any other particular purpose. Hilkach meruba ba'in. Therefore, they needed it to be square. I'm not sure exactly what it means that it had to be square, but it's clear that because it's for an elite owner, it's going to be bigger, right? Because all these, like a big house was 8 by 10, and a traklin is even bigger than that. It's 10 by 10. Rumo kechatzi arko v'kechatzi rachbo uhukai. This line in the Mishnah where it talks about the height, because until now Mishnah only gave us 2 dimensions, the length and the width of each house. And here, this line in the Mishnah refers back to all the houses that were mentioned. Akul hukai, it refers to all of them. Bahainu beit chatnud shehu arko dalet al vav. So, for example, the beit chatnud at the beginning of the Mishnah, that's 4 by 6, oh chamesh. It's going, then it means its height is going to be 5. The hainu chatzi arko v'chatzi rachbo, right? So if you take half of 4 is 2, half of 6 is 3, and you add them together, you get 2 and 3, you get 5. So if it's 4 by 6, that means the height has to be 5. B'bayit katan sheva, that would be for a small house. Shetesha b'bayit rachbo b'bayit katan. I didn't put the. I made a mistake here with the comma. That's my comma. B'bayit katan sheva. Bayit katan is 7, right? Because a bayit katan is 6 by 8, so it's 3 plus 4 is 7. Teisha b'bayit gadol. Bayit gadol is 8 by 10, so it's going to be 4 plus 6. It's going to be 4 plus 5. It's going to be 9 in height. The Eser b'traklin, because it's 10 by 10. Half of 10 is 5. Half of 10 is 5. So the height will be 10. Right. So I'm reading this as if Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is telling us that a proof for this concept of measurements, that the height of a building is supposed to be half of its length plus half of its width, is we'll learn it from the Heichal. So kibinyan Heichal al pnei hadvir arko 40, v'rachbo 20, v'rumo 30. Right. So we see this back in the Sefer Melachim, that the height of the Heichal was 30, and it was built 40 by 20. So take half of 3 is 20, half of 20 is 10, 20 plus 10 is 30, and it was 30 high. Okay, so we learn out, either we learn out from there, or it's just simply a kind of machta that that when you build a building, when you build a house, right? Because the Heichal was, as we see, it's called a bayit. It's called a bayit in the Mikra. Those are going to be the dimensions. So again, in the context of Baba Batra, the Mishnah is trying to lay down for us what the standards were. These were building standards. If you, again, like if you start off in the very beginning of Baba Batra, it talks about people who are neighbors who live in the same chatzer. What are their obligations to each other if they want to put up a fence between their parts and so forth? It's all of these things that are going to be considered standard. They're tkanim. They're basic standards for building and what's expected when you buy something or when you sell something. Okay. So I am going to skip the first parts here where it goes into greater detail to understand the Mishnah better. And we're going to skip up to, there is one part that I wanted to do, but I'm going to leave it. It will become relevant later, and I'll just explain it when it becomes relevant. So the Gemara here, this is later on in the same daf, Rabbi Chanina nafak l'karyata. So Rabbi Chanina, one of the Amoraim, goes out to the towns, right? In which he was going out, probably this was something that some of the Rabbanim at that time would do. They would go around to different towns to learn Torah with the local populace. Amule krai ahadade. So they threw to him, or threw up against each other, two psukim, ahadade, right? One against the other. And they said it's written, and this is in Sefer Melachim that we saw, Rabbayit asher banat hamelech Shlomo l'Hashem, shishim ama arko, v'yasrim rachbo, shoshim ama komato. So this is one pasuk that we saw. It's in Melachim, Perek Vav. It's toward the beginning of the Perek, right? So the house was 60 by 40 by 30. So when we read that pasuk, and we pointed this out last week, when we read the pasuk, it's talking about both the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKodashim, right? Because it's 40 by 60, and I'm sorry, I'm not saying it right. It's 60 by 20. So the 60 includes the 40 of the Heichal and the 20 of the Kodesh HaKodashim. And it says that whole building was 30 high. Uchtiv, and then a few psukim later, it says, in front of the Dvir, which is the wall that separates the Heichal from the Kodesh HaKodashim, Esrim ama orech, v'esrim ama orocha, v'esrim ama komato, exclamation point mine, right? So how can it be? How can it be? We just said that the whole building was 30 high, but now it's telling us that not only the Heichal would have been 30 high, but the Dvir, or the Kodesh HaKodashim, was only 20 high. Amar lehu, so he says to them, Ki kachashiv misvat kruvim ulamala. It's measuring only from the edge of the kruvim upwards. So now we know how tall were the kruvim. How tall? They were 10 amot, right? We saw it both in Melachim and both in the Rehayamim. We know the kruvim stood 10 amot high. So he's saying they only, when they were giving the measurement later on for the Kodesh HaKodashim, in terms of the height, they're only measuring from the height of the kruvim upwards. My kamashma. So first of all, of course, it seems like a bizarre answer, right? I mean, what's the logic of that? Why would it be measured only from the height of the kruvim? If anything, I might think the other one. I should measure maybe just up to the height of the, right? He says this was apparent, and we'll see. This was apparently a tradition that Rabbi Chanina had. That they were measuring only from the height of the kruvim and upwards. My kamash mulan. So what does this teach us? What does this imply to us? Hakamash mulan lamata kilamala. That below, meaning below the kruvim, was like above the kruvim. In what way? Mala mala ein meshamesh klum. Just like above the kruvim, it didn't have use for anything, meaning it was empty. Ein meshamesh means it was empty. Aflamata ein meshamesh klum. Also below, it was empty. The whole area was empty. And the Gemara goes on, right? And the Gemara goes on to say, this, what Rabbi Hanina is saying, is a support for what Rabbi Levi said. Rabbi Levi was also an Amora, who was famous for his drashot. Dama Rabbi Levi, B'itema Rabbi Yochanan, or some people say it was Rabbi Yochanan. He said, "Davar ze masoret biyadenu me'avotenu." This is a tradition we have from our forefathers. Makom aron ukruvim eino min hamida. The place of the aron and the kruvim was not part of the measure. We'll see what that means more explicitly in a moment. Tanya nami hachi. There's a braita that supports contention that says aron she'asa Moshe, the aron that Moses made, yesh lo revach eser amot lechol rach uruach. It had the space of 10 amot in every direction. So what does all this mean? So what the Gemara means, and as we're going to go through, we'll see how the Rashbam explains this. What the Gemara means is that the Kruvim and the Aron that were in Beit of Shlomo were there, but they weren't there. They were there, but somehow they did not take up any physical space. And we'll just read a bit further where this is a little bit more explicit. Amar Rabbanai, Amar Shmuel, Kruvim b'neis hayu omdim. The Kruvim stood in the Beit HaMikdash by way of a miracle. Shinamar, as it says, and this is, we just saw this again in Sefer Melachim, B'chamesh shemot kanafa kruva achat, B'chamesh shemot kanafa kruva shenit, Eser amot miktzot kanafav yad ktzot kanafav. So we understand that, right? They had it's describing the first kruv, that one of his wings was 5, the other wing was 5. So it was 10 amot, one tip of his wing to the other tip of his wing. Gufayu hecha havekaim. Their bodies, where did they stand? There was no, in other words, if it's only wings, where was the body? There had to have been space, there should have been space for a body in between the wings. It says that there's only wing. Rather, we learn from that the body of the Kruvim were there by way of a miracle, meaning, as we'll see, this will become, to go through the Rashbam, they were there, but not in any physical capacity, did not take up any physical space. Now, before we go into this, again, if you looked at this, you'll see the next part of this sugya here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 replies to this contention. Other Amoraim challenge this notion and say it's not mukhrach that there was some kind of a miracle going on. You can understand the psukim differently, but in order to understand what they're attacking, we have to first go through and understand the basic content. So let's go back and try to
learn. We also learn in other details that the Beit did not, that the rules of space did not entirely apply in the Beit. For that to
So-
be pure vote, it talks about how there'd always be space on Hatzir for everyone. And there's
Yes.
also
Right. In other words, right, that even though this, right, when people came, it's one, okay, this ma'amar here, that the kruvim b'nei hein omdin, this appears in actually in our Masechta in Yoma, and it also appears in the Gemara and Megillah, and in the Gemara and Megillah, it's brought, actually, Michael, well said, because it's brought as part of it's brought in relationship to other miracles that were to have taken place in Yerushalayim, right? And one of them was that even when the Azara filled up with people, right, like, and they were all squeezed together, but somehow miraculously there was space for all of them to bow down, right? And we also know that there was space in Yerushalayim for everybody to stay over. And, there are other things. We're not going to get to that tonight, but yes, you're right, and it's related to that. But there's a lot of things going on here, and it's a fascinating concept.
now would this be related also to the way that certain time-bound commandments don't apply in the bites? So, for example, for avodat habayit laws, I mean, many Shabbat restrictions don't apply.
It's not exact the same. And I'll just tell you quickly. It's why am I saying it's not the same? There's certainly
the same but related.
It's somewhat related, but you know what? Think of it like this. You see, when the Torah gives us any given mitzvah, sometimes a given mitzvah is going to have certain exceptions. And for example, and this is also not precisely the same, but it's similar. The Torah says, lo tirtzach, right? But the Gemara says, lo tirtzach is hutra miklalo. It's released from its general rule in the case of an execution of Beit Din. Beit Din has a commandment to execute somebody under certain circumstances. So it's hutra miklalo. When we talk about, let's say burning korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat, there Shabbat is nidchet. There's a difference between hutar and nidchet, but the Torah tells us, the same Torah that told us that you keep Shabbat said that Kohanim burn korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash. So it's not because it's time bound per se. It's because, I mean, I'm not saying it's not entirely related, but the basic concept is it's more basic than that. The same Torah that tells us X also to Y. Torah says you keep Shabbat, you're not allowed to burn things, but on Shabbat in the Beit HaMikdash you do burn things. So it's an important concept, but I think I'll leave it at that for right. Let's go back.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, might it be that because since in the second temple the dvir was empty, so maybe they might imagine that if you want the second temple to be as close to the first temple as possible, so maybe you could imagine that what was in the dvir in the first temple was not completely real.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've been thinking along similar lines, and I'll tell you. When we get to the end of this, I'll give you my take on that. But I think there is something to that. In other words, just as a placeholder for this idea, let's consider that maybe in Bayit Sheni, when there was no Aron and there were no Kruvim, there was still a concept that that may not have been leikuva, right? It does keep us from still having the Kohen Gadol go into Kodesh Kodeshim and do all of the avodah, because the concept
as if.
Right, the concept is actually there. And even in Bayit Rishon, there was something otherworldly about the presence, the Kruvim and the Aron, that they were there, but they somehow did not take up any space. It sounds a little bit like a Hasidic story, right? It's like the famous story of the Baal Shem Tov, who goes in when and he lights a fire, and he says, he goes into the forest when bad things are happening to the Jews, and he lights a fire and he says a prayer, and then his Talmud, Mezrich, he knows where to go in the forest, and he knows how to pray, but he doesn't remember how to say the prayer, and so forth, and so on, and so on. So I think it's a little bit like that. Michael Werner, what did you want to say?
No, we might even push it back even farther and note that the Keruvim in the Mishkan were physically impossible. If in fact, I mean, it's like I think I've talked about this in relation to the menorah, but like, if they're made out of a single piece of pure gold, they should not be able to stand up, because pure gold is too soft to stand up. It would have to be an alloy of some kind, rather than Zahav Tahor, which is what is specified in Shemot.
Right. Right, and that's a very it's interesting you bring up. When I was living in Dayton temporarily, about in 2009, one of the people who used to come to shul was an Israeli who had lived in Dayton for many years already. He was an international expert in metallurgy and in materials, and he took a particular interest in the history of materials. And he studied a lot of these things about the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, asking questions like this. And he, of course, what you're saying, you don't need a doctorate in metallurgy to know this, but he said, yes, it couldn't have been pure gold because of what you're saying. Pure gold would not stand. It would what's the word? It would settle. Right, because it doesn't have integrity. In any event, all very interesting. Let's get to some of the details of this in the last half hour, and because there are a lot of other things I want to connect this to. Okay, so let's go back now and look at the sugya and try to understand it step by step. So Rabbi Chanina nafak l'karyata. So Rabbi Chanina went out to the towns. Ramule ahadade. Ramule, Rashbam says, B'nei ha'ayarot krai ahadade. So the people in the towns, through these psukim, one against the other. K'tiv shishim ama arko min hamizrach v'marav. So the Rashbam is going to fill out the picture here. It says the Beit HaMikdash was 60 in length, from east to west. Mipetach ha'echal ad kotel ma'aravi, right? From the time you would enter into the hechal until you got to the far wall, which would be the western wall of the Beit HaMikdash, 60 amot. So Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim, the western wall of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Hainu, that is 40 amot the orech hechal. The hechal was 40 amot. Esrim amot the Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Kodeshim was 20. Ushoshim amot komato, and it was 30 high. Nimsa shegam Kodesh HaKodeshim rumo shoshim amot. So we see from that, as we learn from that would be the plain pshat of the pasuk, that the Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim was 30 high, just like the Heichal, because it's given to Stam in this pasuk. It's pasuk Dalet. Uchti b'pasuk acher v'yasrim amot komato. Dichtiv, right? It says elsewhere that the Kodesh HaKodeshim was 20 high, as it says, V'lifnei hadvir esrim. In front of the dvir, in front of the separation, there was 20. Klomar lifni michitzat Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim, inside the barrier, the separation between the Echal and the Kodesh HaKodeshim, Vihi amatraksin shekruya dvir. That wall, as we learned in other shiurim, was called the amatraksin. It was called in Sefer Melachim, it's called the dvir. Esrim ama orech min hamizrach lemarav. It went 20 amot from east to west. Esrim ama roch from north to south. Esrim ama komato, and it was 20 in height. So how do you reconcile these two psukim? They said to Rabbi Chanina. So Rabbi Chanina says to them, Ki kachashiv, when the pasuk is making its calculation of esrim de komad beit hakodashim misfat kruvim ulamala kachashiv, when it's making its calculation of the height of the kodesh kodashim, it's calculating from the end, from the tip of the kruvim and upwards. Shakruvim shel Shlomo, the kruvim that Shlomo made, shnaim hayu omdim ala karka. There were two that would stand on the ground. Echad miyamin haaron tzilkotam aravi, echad mismolo. Right. So one of them was on the right side of the Aron, near the western Eitzel Kotel Maravi, near the western wall. And I mentioned this last time. Yamin is going. Yamin is generally going to be referring in this context. Yamin is going to be south, and left is going to be north. So one of them, Yamin Haron Etzel Kotam Aravi, near the western wall, V'achad mismolo, one to its left, V'rumo Eser, and its height was 10. Kedichti behedya b'mlachim, as it's written explicitly in Mlachim that they were 10 high. V'chanfehen prusot mikir lakir, their wings were spread from wall to wall. Kanaf echad nogea b'kir tzafona, v'kanaf chaveron nogea b'kir dromi. Right. So one kanaf touches the northern wall, one touches the southern wall. Nimtza meroshe hakruvim l'mala. So we find from the heads of the kruvim and up, esrim ama ad hagag. It would be 20 amot until you would reach the roof. It should be more, particularly the ceiling, but that's a separate issue. Dotan shel Moshe al gabek hakoporet. As we said and as we know, the kruvim of Moshe were not like that. They sat on top of the kaporet. My kamashmalan. So of course, what does it teach us? In other words, what am I learning from this? Lama li. So the Rashbam understands the question like this: Lama li dekachashiv kra ki hai gavna misvat kruvim ulamala lema shloshim amal mato. Why should the pasuk make such a calculation? What, in other words, the question, the way he phrases it, my kamashon, what does it teach us, or what does it imply to us? It's implying what the Rashbam is saying. And it implies that I want to know why is it that the pasuk should tell us such a thing? Why should it make such a calculation of 20 from the height, the kruvim, and upwards? It must be there to teach us something. What? Nothing. Okay. So in answers, it comes to teach us that what's below is like what's above. The Rashbam explains, Tahani Esra Amot Shakruvim Ha'aron Omdin Bahen Kamo Ha'esrim Shalamala, that the 10 Amot in which the Kruvim and the Aron are situated, they're like the 20 Amot above them. Maha Esrim Kulan Chala Ve'ein Bahen Davar, just like the area that's in the upper 20 Amot of the Kodesh HaKodashim is empty and has nothing in it. Kach gam ha'eser v'guf ha'kruvim b'neis hayu omdim. So also the 10 amot below the kanafayim, and the bodies of the Kruvim stood there by way of nes, as is said later on, right? We saw that language later on. Umakom ha'aron eino min hamidah. The place of the Aron is also not counted as part of the measurement. Ela ben nes haya omed. It also stood there by way of a nes. V'chanfei hakruvim shehein ba'avir, and the wings of the kruvim that were in the air, lo chaitzi, they didn't separate. Daha lamata didhu ulamala didhu yicholim limdod esrim rekanot mikotel tzfoni lekotel dromi. They didn't separate because below them and above them you could measure 20 empty amot from the northern wall to the southern wall. V'hachi mashma kra, and this is the implication of the pasuk. Yasrim ama komato, the height was 20 amot. Komar kol hashloshim amot koma, the height of all the 30 amot. Einan chashuvim ele ke'esrim, they're only considered to be like the 20, the misfat kruvim umala, from the edges of the kruvim and upwards. Shein pnuyim miklum, that there's nothing there. Ha'eser kamo ha'esrim, and the 10 that's below is like the 20 that's above. This one part here, it seems to indicate, right, that also even the wings were also not somehow physically there. And what he's saying here is, we started off, right, the first pasuk that's brought in the sugya, it tells us that the space of the Kodesh HaKodeshim was 20 by 20. So one way to understand that is that wherever you measured, it was always going to be 20 by 20. So it must mean there's nothing blocking you to measure 20 by 20. Every part of the room you could measure 20 by 20. So it means that also even the wings of the kruvim do not somehow block us from measuring 20 by 20, like 20 from north to south, where their wings stood. Okay, so it's implying something obviously very mystical and somewhat bizarre, but let's go down this path. And the Gemara goes down this path. So Gemara goes on to say, Messiah Rabbi Levi. So what Rabbi Hanina is just saying now, this is a support for Rabbi Levi, Tema Rabbi Yochanan. דבר זה מסורת בידינו מאבותינו, מקום ארון וקרובים אינו מן המידה. And Tanya Nami Hachi, we also learn in a Braita, Aron Shasa Moshe, yesh lo revach 10 amot l'chol ruach v'ruach. We have as a tradition that the Aron that Moshe made, you could measure from the Aron to all sides 10 amot. Well, how can that be? Because the Aron of Moshe was 2.5 amot by 1.5 amot. So how could you measure from it 10 to all sides? Because the whole room is only 20. So it means that it didn't take up any space at all. Rashbam says, Aron shasa Moshe keshinitan beveit kodesh hakodeshim shasa Shlomo. The Aron of Moshe, when it was put into the Kodesh HaKodeshim in Binyan Shlomo and Bayit Rishon, Shehu Kaf al Kaf, that was 20 by 20, Yesh lo 10 amot revach l'kol ruach v'ruach. It had a space of 10 amot to every direction, l'yamino u'lismalo, both to its right and to its left. Harei esrim below Aron, but it's 20 without the Aron. Lufanav kaf ad hadvir. And right in front of it, there's, and also going the other direction, it's 20, right? 20 from north to south, 20 from east to west. How could it be that the Aron of Moshe has 10 amot going in any direction? It must mean that somehow it doesn't take up any space. So it's there, but it doesn't take up any physical space.
It's there, but it doesn't take any physical space, but the space in which it isn't in is still there.
Yes.
You understand? There's nothing inside the space, but the space is there. Because they do the measure above the space in which is not there. Or better, in which there is nothing.
To put it in maybe more modern terms, it's like it's in a different dimension. In other words, everything that we're learning,
it's a hologram.
Well, actually, I was thinking about that. In other words, we might experience that as a hologram. It doesn't say. See, this is what's interesting. It doesn't say that you can't see it. It says it doesn't take up any space. So somehow it's there. It's both there and it's not there, right? It's like Schrodinger's cat.
By the way, you could rebuild the Mikdash as a hologram.
You could, but
this is not a hologram in the sense that you presumably also can touch it. So presumably,
there's nothing to touch.
Object that does not occupy space. So a hologram would only be visible, but not apprehensible by any other sense.
Right. No, the hologram is only light. Now, was this only light? So here's the thing. Let's just think about this. We read in the Psukim that Shlomo brought the Aron into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. There was a physical Aron that went into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. But somehow, when it was in there, it no longer takes up any dimensional space.
I mean, excuse me, I believe there's also Midrash or Nagadata about when Shlomo was trying to bring it in and realized the doors weren't wide enough or something to that effect. I don't.
Well, that's the there's it's drush in the Gemara in Shabbos. It's the drush on the psukim of Susharim Rashechem. But and I can give you the reference to that. And that may also play into this in a way, in a kind of indirect way, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But the point is, we read Sefer Melachim and we read from Divrei Hayamim. We know that Shlomo built Kruvim. We know that he had the Aron, and presumably we see here that the Aron that he had was the Aron of Moshe, right? But he had the Aron of Moshe, and then he made his own Kruvim for reasons that are not detailed in the Mikra, and he puts them in. But there's a tradition that once they are in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, they no longer take up any physical space. And they are there by way of a miracle. So let's just read this next part. And I think that's as much as we're going to get up to today. I'll leave you with some other food for thought. Amar Rabbanai Amar Shmuel, Kruvim b'neis hein omdim. The Kruvim, we'll look at the Rashbam, the Shlomo, the Kruvim of Shlomo, b'neis hein omdim, gufan. Their bodies stood by way of a nes. Shneamar, וחמש אמות כנף הכרוב האחת, וחמש אמות כנף הכרוב השנית, 10 אמות מקצות כנפיו ועד קצות כנפיו. So here, this is where the Rashbam gives his parshanut on that pasuk, and this is the way I explained it to you earlier in the shiur. I learned it from the Rashbam. Knaf hakruv echad, knaf ha'echad shel kruv, right, one wing of one kruv. The chamesh meot knaf hasheni shel oto kruv. The second knaf was also 5 of the same kruv. Beloved the kruv sheni kamairi. It's not talking about the second kruv when it says kanafa kruv hashenit. The haktiv batrei ve'eser ba'ama hakruv hasheni. We saw the next pasuk describes the second kruv. So here, when it says kanafa kruv hasheni, it's talking about the first kruv and his second wing. The eser amot miktzot kanafav aktzot kanafav. Right, and the wingspan is 10. Mehacha. Now, this is also important part. We don't learn from this yet that the body of the kruv stood by way of a miracle. Between the two wings. From one tip to the other tip is only 10 amot. Came haguf shebeintayim hechan. And then you'll say, okay, so the goof, the body of the kruv, where would it have been? Because we have the whole wingspan. Where's the body? You can't say that question comes up because of what we're learning here in this pasuk. Dim kain my de kaparich lekaman. Because if it's so, why did they ask later on? We didn't see this part of the sugya yet. That's the next part of the sugya, where Amoraim start to challenge this whole concept. But they start to ask, "V'dilma beta me'elai ravach v'kushiot acherot v'loshaychi hachaklal." Because they start to ask, you know what? I'll explain this first part of the Rashbam when we do that part of the sugya. There, it'll be easier to understand. But he's saying, based on the questions that we see later on, it must be that we haven't learned from here yet this concept that the body of the kruvim were somehow incorporeal. But what we do learn out of this pasuk is this: if you came to put together the two wings of the kruv, one next to the other. In other words, I could read this pasuk not as describing the entire wingspan plus. Wait a second. It's like this. You might think that this is the problem, that when I read this pasuk, it's telling me that one wing is 5, another wing is 5, and it's 10 from tip to tip. And then you'll say, okay, so where's the body? And the Rashbam is saying, no, don't jump. That's not the problem here yet. Because I could also understand this in a more simple way. I can understand it's telling me one kanaf is 5, one kanaf is 5. And if I were to put them together, then it would be 10 altogether. I could read it like that and not ask this question. So he's saying, this idea that the kruvim b'nei Einom Din, I don't actually learn it directly from this pasuk, which is what the Gemara seems to be implying. He says, so he says, Elakra hachi mashmale. This is what the pasuk is implying. If you were to put the two wings next together, side by side, then you would see they would be 10 long. But nonetheless, you could say that it was actually longer than 10. Because then you would add onto it the width of the body, right? And it's just that this pasuk is not talking about the body of the kruvim. It's only talking about its wings. Actually, this question really comes from here. You have to bring in this other information. Sherocha beit kodshei kodoshim mitzafon l'darom lo haya ela 20 mama. Right? We know that from north to south there was only a space of 20 amot. ובית הקרובים היו כנפיהם כף לבד הגופים. And we know from this pasuk, we know that the wingspan, the wings, even if I put them together without the bodies, were 10, right? So the wingspan is 10 without the bodies. The wingspan is 10 without the bodies. And it also says a little further, כנף אחד בקיר, כנף הכרוב השני נוגעת בקיר השני, וכנפיהם על תוך הבית נוגעות כנף על כנף. Now, this is the problem. From the pasuk that Rabbanai brings, that's not enough information for me to ask this question. But if I take this information that their wingspan was 10, and there are two of them side by side, so I know that their wingspans take up 20. And now I know from another pasuk that the tips of their wings on each side touched the wall, and then the inner tips touched each other. Now I can question, where were their bodies? Now that I know all that, because let's say that, what if the room was 22 amot wide? Then I wouldn't have this problem. But now that I know that it's only now, because I know it's 20, now I have the problem. If this is so, if the width of the house is only 20, and their wings take up 20, so where are the bodies of the kruvim? So because you're kasal kadatach, it'll go up in your mind. You'll think shehaknafim bekruv kidei adam, because your first thought is that the wings are like the arms of a person. Echad mitzad yamin v'echad mitzad smol v'haguf b'intayim. In other words, the whole question is premised on imagining that the kruv is like a human being with wings. So if it's like a human being with wings, and the wings are there in place of arms, so then I have to ask, where's the body? That's the premise of the question. So the Rashbam is going out of his way, just so you understand very well, that when Rabbanai brings this pasuk, Chamesh Shemot Kanaf Akruv Echad, etc., it's that pasuk combined with the knowledge that there's only 20 amot, and that we know that the wings touched each wall and they touched each other. On the basis of that, I have to ask this question, where were the bodies? And on the basis of that, Rabbanai will say in the name of Shmuel that the bodies of the Kruvim stood by way of a nace. Again, meaning that somehow they did not take up any space. So as we'll see next week, there's 5 challenges to this whole concept. The first one being, we won't go into all of them, but the first one being, Matkif Abai attacks this whole premise. He says, Dilma boltin ketarnegolin havuk kaimi. Maybe their wings didn't come out of the sides like arms of a person. Maybe they went up like the back of a rooster, where they come up and essentially they start from the same point and go out.
They come from the spine, like a bird.
Yeah, exactly, right. By the way, I went in, I was looking at different different websites to make sure I understood. That's what I thought, but I was looking at like bird skeletons and anatomy of a rooster and all of that. But yeah, they come up like that. There are other challenges to this, and they're all very interesting unto themselves. I'll just show you, and it's just as well that we got up this far, because I wanted to make illustrations, and I did start to make one here. This is like a very sort of, from the moment, crude illustration of, if this is the Kodesh HaKodashim, this would be the... Yes.
why does nobody suggest that the ceiling is 10 amah low? Maybe you have kind of niche with the lower ceiling. This is perfectly possible.
Actually, somebody does suggest that. Not a niche, but you'll see later on. There's a concept in the part of the sugya that we skipped. A certain concept came up that certain buildings might have been, even before we get to the sugya, that it was known certain buildings are built where the base of the wall is a certain width, a certain thickness, and as it would go up, it would get narrow and narrower. And so that's one of the challenges to this whole theory. Maybe the 20 by 20 is the base of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but as it went up, there was more room, and we'll see. So don't think that nobody brings that up. That is, in fact, one of the challenges to this whole theory. We'll go through this. I want to leave you with a particular thought now that it's the end of the shir. So this phrase, "B'neis hein omdim," right? The Kruvim stood by way of a nes. This "B'neis hein omdim," it also the Gemara also uses this phrase in a different context, and based on my limited knowledge of Shas and using search engines, I think these are the only two places. So here, in the context that we're using it, the Nes Hein Omdim, it seems to have this meaning that something that has a corporeal reality, right? It exists in the real world, but somehow in this context takes up no physical space. The other place where we see this concept, which is one of the things you learn when you learn Sofrut, but you may be familiar with this Gemara. Just a second. There's a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat and in Masechet Megillah that says as follows. I brought it from the Gemara in Shabbat. Daf Kaf Daled Amud Aleph. It says, Amar Rav Chisda, Mem v'samech shebeluchot b'neis hayu omdim. The mem and the samech, the luchot of Moshe Rabbeinu, stood by way of a miracle, right? So what's the idea? I see you people are nodding their heads. So do you understand? Do you know this concept? Do you somebody want to say what it means? Go ahead. Anybody?
Well, the first set of luchot, the letters were actually cut all the way through, meaning that we've got the mem and the samach. Somehow the center needs to be suspended somehow. Right.
Very good. Actually, both were Kenira Charut Mishneh Tzadim. So here it says the B'neis hayu omdim. So what does that mean that they stood by way of a nes? It means, like what you said, that the center of the samach and the center of the mem stuma, the mem sofit, which are stone, stood by way of an nes, meaning that they were not connected by stone to the body of the tablet. So,
yes, but they are there. The matter is still there.
Yes.
And for the Kruvim, it's not the same because they are the nest. It is as if they are not material or something.
Yafeh.
But here the material is there.
Yafeh.
Or as Yates would put it, the center cannot hold.
So, exactly, and that's why I'm bringing it here. I want to point out that the phrase seems to imply, in other words, both of them are implying here that there's an ace, right? But the manifestation of the nes is actually, each of them are different, right? They're in sharp contrast to one another, because one of them is saying there's a physical reality of the luchot that when you looked at them, you could see the mem and you could see the samach. And the reason you knew that they were a mem and a samach is because the center, which was there, was standing in the middle of the air, right? Was suspended in midair. But as Paul's emphasizing, but it was there, like you could see it, and it was there, you could touch it. And here, I mean, I don't know. Here's the thing about the body of the Kruvim and the Aron. Maybe you could also see them, but somehow they don't take up any space at all. It's almost the opposite of the way B'nai Sayom Dimpo. The other thing the question I want to leave you with is when we talk about a nes, we've touched on this here and there, but we've never gone deeply into it. But I think maybe in your own studies you've come across this. Well, we did talk about actually when I gave Shir a few years ago on Hanukkah, we went into it a little bit more. What does it mean that something is a nes? A nes is not just a magic trick, right? In other words, the idea of nes is that there's something that is supernatural. It's me'al hateva, literally supernatural, but it's there for a reason. It's there to accomplish something, right? It's like I say, it's not just a magic trick. God doesn't do magic tricks. He does nisim to accomplish particular ends. So we don't have to delve into it necessarily here in the Gemara Shabbat, but in our Gemara, it's something to think about. And I don't want you to jump and tell me what you think right now. I really want you to think about this. Taking this taking this basic concept that the Aron and the Kruvim, B'nai Sayuamdim, Zeh kol tov yefeh, but to what end? And this, I'll say, Paul, before you say what you will say now, might relate to the question you brought up, to the point you brought up much earlier, that maybe there's some important aspect to somehow a non-corporeal aspect of the Aron and the Kruvim. But what did you want to say now?
Yes. Could there be a nes mitmashech? Because usually the nes is something which happens at a certain time. As you say, the Rambam said it, that there is a nes when you need it. Yeah, I don't know. And it always happens at a certain moment, or a certain time. It could take a day or something like this, or an hour or a minute. But here, it takes forever. Well, if the Beit HaMikdash would still be there, the mess would be mitmashech all the time.
So, I mean, look, the other example here in the case of the Luchot would also be a nes mitmashech. It would also be an ongoing nes. I'm not going to try to answer your question right now. I can't think right now of another example where we have a nes that wasn't in a specific moment in time, unless, but here, I can, but it depends on what we consider to be a nes. It depends on what we consider to be a nes. This morning, I was, so I've been working on this sugya now for the last, I don't know, a couple of weeks to try to be able to present it as easily as I did. It's a tough sugya. It's a tough concept. It's also tough to read the Gemara. But I'm really, I did already start to look at other Mefarshim to see if they'll address at least this last question. And I did find something in the Chidushei Agadot of the Maharal. The Maharal wrote Chidushim on certain Agadot of Shas, not on all of them, but I have it printed out in 4 volumes, and it's also it's in the most recent edition of Bar Ilan. It's also here. He does talk about this, and so I will try to introduce that later if you want. I will be happy to send you the texts in advance. Anybody who wants, if you're interested, it's very tough, and I only occasionally learn the Maharal, and I've learned the Maharal enough to know he develops his own nomenclature, right? So there's certain words that he uses that means something very, very specific to him that don't necessarily correspond to the way we think of it, certainly in modern Hebrew, but even in other classical Hebrew. It's sort of like if you've ever, similarly, like if you've ever learned like Rav Kook. Rav Kook also develops his own nomenclature. And if you want to understand Rav Kook, and I believe me, I know even less about the Kitvei of Rav Kook than I do of the Maharal. But I've learned enough to know that if you really want to understand it, you have to learn it with somebody who's learned it, or you have to really go through like the breadth of his writings and put it together. So it's tough stuff. But I'm going to try to when we finish this sugya, I'm going to try to summarize it. Anyway, I think this is a fascinating concept, and I'll leave it at that. And just again to bring it back home to finish off for tonight. So remember, I started off with this question of where does the Kohen Gadol stand when he does the avodah, and now we have, in a sense, a kind of a new concept to deal with, which is, so when the Kohen Gadol in Beit Shel Shlomo goes in to do the avodah in Yom Kippurim, what's there? What does he perceive, and where does he stand in relationship to these items that are both there and not there? Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Have a good rest of your day or evening, and Bezrat Hashem, I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night. Night there. Good night.
Right, and good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.